And without further ado, can I pass the floor to Tim? So Professor Tim Townshend from Newcastle University, we are very much looking forward to your presentation, Tim. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amelia. It's a great pleasure to be here, and as you say, in front of a live audience, it's a little bit different, but with the technical backup as well, it's great, isn't it? It's best of both worlds. As Amelia says, I'm Professor Tim Townshend. I'm Professor of Urban Design for Health at the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape, Newcastle University. Today is the official launch of my little book. Don't worry, I won't be signing copies in the foyer or anything like that during the break. But there are a couple of inspection copies. I think there's one in here and one at the Fuse desk if you want to have a quick look at any time this morning. I've been researching the links between health, well-being and built environment for about 20 years now. And I suppose the book really is kind of a collection of my thoughts, how they've developed over that time, and in which I hope is a sort of a nice kind of easy, accessible format. But to kind of launch into the topic this morning, I thought I'd just very briefly reflect on the fact that the aspiration to plan for a healthier future really isn't anything new. The whole foundation of this thing we now call town planning, or spatial planning is a more contemporary term, was really founded on a concern for people's health, to create places which would enable people to live healthier lives and to thrive. And this is illustrated nicely by this visual, which comes from some early planning thinking, what became known as the Garden City movement. And I won't go into the details of it, but basically what it's showing is an aspiration to try and combine those healthy, physically healthy aspects of the countryside, so access to fresh air, space to be physically active, and access to fresh produce, with those more kind of psychologically healthy aspects of the city. So an opportunity for an education, access to cultural facilities, the ability to broaden your circle of social contacts, maybe find a life partner, all these kind of things that in modern parlance we would call important to our well-being. Obviously well-being wasn't a term back then. And this aspiration to build healthier places really was founded on the idea that the two disciplines of public health and planning would kind of work closely in conjunction with each other. And for much of the 20th century, that was quite true. But by the time we get to the kind of end of the century, into the 21st, the two disciplines have rather gone their separate ways. However, the environmental impacts of our towns and cities on our health and well-being certainly didn't go away, even if they were impacting our health and well-being in slightly different ways than the 19th century. So we were no longer dealing with sort of epidemics of cholera and typhoid, those kind of things. However, we were thinking about things more like sort of lifestyle diseases, sedentary lifestyles, those kind of things. So public health began to kind of rediscover, if you like, the importance of the built environment kind of in the 1990s. Work by people like Dahlgren and Whitehead re-envisaged in this now very well-known diagram by Barton and Grant, and I'm sure many of you have seen this in presentations before, which just kind of reminds us that at the root of our health and well-being is ourself. Our age, our gender, our genetic makeup, those kind of things. Beyond that, it's our lifestyle. Do we have a job? Do we have supportive social networks? These kind of things. But beyond that, there is this whole sphere of the built environment and the way in which it either constrains our lives or provides opportunities for us to have healthier lives. Now, the Barton and Grant model is fantastic because it's very neat, and it very simply describes a lot of very complex issues. What I try to do in the book is then try and break down that kind of holistic viewpoint into some perhaps more sort of tangible aspects of the built environment, and try and think about how those impact our daily lives. Now, these things are very overlapping and interrelated. So, for example, I look at things like green infrastructure, all that green area of the city. I also look at active travel. We know that people are more likely to be active in green areas. So where does the research fit within those two things? Well, it fits in both. So as I say, these things are not sort of discrete and separate. They're all kind of interlinked, which I try and kind of get that feeling with this little diagram. Now, I haven't got time, obviously, to go through all of these topics this morning. We would be here all day, and I haven't got all day. So I'm going to look at a couple, and I've chosen first to launch this with looking at green infrastructure. As I say, literally all those sort of green and blue areas of the city. So everything from, a street tree to something like the town mall in Newcastle would count as green infrastructure. And the reason I've chosen this is because it's definitely got the most robust evidence base in terms of our understanding of the links between green infrastructure and our health and well-being. But we wouldn't even really need an evidence base, do we? If we think about what happened during COVID and after lockdown, as soon as lockdown was lifted, everybody rushed out to their nearest park or their nearest beauty spot. That desperate kind of want, that desperate need to be kind of immersed or have that connection with nature was so very obvious, because that's what people had been deprived of. And all sorts of things happened during lockdown. This is in the back lane around from where I live. Someone created this little community garden because, they were so desperate to get their hands kind of dirty and grow a few plants and that kind of thing. So there was a huge literature, and I shall try and summarise that very quickly this morning. Different authors divide this down in different ways. Some people divide it into 4 or 5 different themes, but I think you can kind of summarise it all quite neatly in 3 overarching topics. So there's the idea of facilitation, the fact that green space provides space for things to happen. So it provides place for us to socialise, it provides place for us to take our children to run around and be active, it provides spaces for park run and all those kind of things. Really good for both our physical and our mental well-being. And reducing things like feelings of social isolation. We know people who live in greener environments think their neighbourhoods are, or perceive their neighbourhoods to be more friendly and to be more sociable, for example, so cutting down on things like loneliness in old age. Mitigation, again, a whole series of ways in which green infrastructure can really help mitigate environmental determinants of ill health and well-being. So things like reducing air pollution, reducing noise pollution by using planting as buffering, mitigating things like heat island effect, the idea of basically the overheating of urban areas in summertime, something we're going to have to think much more about in Europe in the years to come. Mitigating things like flooding. So all of these things can be mitigated through greater green infrastructure. And perhaps most kind of interestingly, the effect on restoring our mental health that green space has. Now, again, some of this is very well known. There are 2 key theories. The stress reduction theory of Ulrich, who I'm sure many of you will know this one. Basically, Ulrich observed hospital patients recovering from surgery and realised that those patients with a view of nature took less analgesics and recovered more quickly than those that had no view. So we've got stress reduction on one side, and then Kaplan's attention restoration theory, which is slightly different, but basically says that modern life overloads our cognitive responses, and that when we relate to nature, when we hear birds sing or look at flowers or watch a bee pollinating, that kind of resets our cognitive capabilities. And many pieces of research basically suggest that ART and SRT probably work kind of in conjunction. So we must build greener places, or we must aspire to have greener places for the future. And what's very interesting to me is this is actually happening in all sorts of ways, at all sorts of scales, and from all sorts of perspectives. So I'll give you two completely different ones here. The image on the left-hand side is from a really interesting community-driven project called Incredible Edible Todmorden. This was a project that started quite a few years ago now, probably about 10. Small handful of local people in Todmorden, it's on the Yorks-Lancashire border, very traditional kind of mill town, decided they wanted to green up their town. But rather than just make it look pretty, they decided to plant fruit and vegetables everywhere. And basically they just guerrilla gardened, they got no permission, they just went ahead and did it and used all sorts of bits of leftover space, some of which were hard spaces like the car park in the local station. I think they did actually get permission for that one, where they had to build up the planters because the land was so polluted. This bit of land is just a bit of one of those leftover bits of green space next to a care home, and they've covered it with rhubarb plants. Apparently rhubarb is one of the most popular plants to grow. As soon as it kind of produces fruit, people are out there chopping it off. Swiss chard is the least, because nobody knows what to do with it. But anyway, there you are. The image on the right-hand side is a interesting project from Swindon, Oakfield. This is the first time that the not-for-profit making Nationwide Building Society has been involved in property development. And basically they decided to get involved with this area. It's an old college campus, and they inserted a community organiser in the sort of surrounding area for 18 months before they went anywhere near a plan. And the guy just spent time basically hanging out, rather than those sort of very stuffy public consultations. This guy just, spent time hanging out in the fish and chip queue, or knocking on people's doors, or going into schools, asking people what they aspired to. And what came through really, really clearly is people wanted green space for their children to be able to play, green space for older people to go out and socialise. And so this whole development is set around a sort of green spine, which runs through the middle of it. So really interesting. So there's a real demand, a real need for this, as I say, at all sorts of levels and in all sorts of ways. And in many ways, green spaces should be fantastic for tackling health inequalities, because, going into your local park is free to use. It doesn't need any specialist equipment. This should be a really good way of levelling up our health inequalities across places. However, we must remember that not all green spaces are equal. And Amelia and I and our researcher Rachel Gallo were involved in a little project a few years ago where we looked at park spaces in Newcastle, and in particular a park in a relatively wealthy area and one in a much poorer area. And what we found was that basically the green space in the poorer area was much, it had the same sorts of things, it had a play area, but the play area was much less exciting, it was much less well maintained, there was much more evidence of sort of vandalism and graffiti and those kind of things. So basically the green space was inferior, even though it was more intensively used by children and young people. But beyond the green space, it wasn't just the fact that the green space was poorer in the poorer area. The food environment that you encountered as soon as you got beyond the park gate, so you'd been in there all afternoon and you wanted a snack on the way home, the food environment beyond was much poorer quality as well. So there was much more variety on offer in the more wealthy area, which brings me kind of nice and neatly round to food environments. And I know we're going to talk a lot about food environments in the rest of this morning's talks. So I just want to kind of set out the relationship I see between the food environment and built environment. And basically the food environment is any opportunity to obtain food from the built environment around us. And that includes sociocultural, economic and policy influences. So literally anything from a drive-through sausage roll from a very well-known Northeast bakery, other offers are obviously available, through to the free cabbages and chives, again just popping back to Todmorden. So it encompasses this incredibly wide range of issues, and thereby the relationship with built environment, food environment, and further on planning the built environment is incredibly complex. But one area we do know more about than perhaps some others is the phenomenon of hot food takeaways. Now, again, I just go through this very briefly because some of this will be familiar to a lot of you. What are the basic issues? Well, as Amelia, I'm sure, would remind me, no food can be labelled obesogenic. However, we do know that hot food takeaway food is implicated in excess weight gain and obesity. Hot food takeaway outlets cluster in poorer parts of the city. People from lower socioeconomic groups are more susceptible to over-consuming hot food takeaways. And secondary school children, particularly when they get a little bit of independence and get the bit of money to buy the tea on the way home or whatever, they are more at risk at overconsumption as well. And the end result of this is that children from poorer backgrounds are twice as likely to be overweight or obese than their affluent counterparts. And why is this sort of interesting from a built environment planning perspective? Well, again, this is all quite complicated, so I shall try and summarise this quite briefly. Basically, the planning system in the UK separates out land uses into different classes. Now, mostly these are quite broad. So, for example, Class A1 are shops. You can imagine there's a vast variety of things within that class. Hot food takeaways used to have a separate class of their own, which is quite unusual for a kind of a relatively narrow definition, which was A5. That no longer stands, but they are in what is called sui generis, which is basically no particular class. However, it's a kind of almost sort of a ragbag, if you like, of what you might say are bad neighbours, sort of things that would cause disturbance or nuisance. So scrap yards, taxi firms, nightclubs, these are all in sui generis. So they're a category that planning does seek to regularise. Therefore, there is a possibility for the planning system to control hot food takeaways in more sensitive areas. And as I say, I'm not going to say too much about this because I know other speakers this morning are going to say more about it. Through planning guidance and planning policy. And for example, there's a really fantastic bit of work by Gateshead Council, their hot food takeaway supplementary planning document. I know Lucy Greenfield is going to talk to us later, and I'm sure she'll be telling us more about that. The one thing I would say is the planning system is not a magic wand. It can't get rid of things that exist already. So unfortunately, if you've got a load of hot food takeaways clustered around your secondary school, they're going to be there for some time. You can't get rid of them through the planning system, but it can prevent further proliferation. So it's a very blunt system, and it's not particularly designed for managing food environments, but it is there and it has been used. So it's kind of interesting. But again, there are all sorts of other kind of issues which I know other speakers are going to bring up. Beyond the issue of hot food, I would like to kind of discuss is that in the same sort of areas where you get clusters of hot food, you also tend to get other outlets and services which have the potential to be harmful to our health and well-being. So I draw on the idea of obesogenic environments, so the idea of environments which create or promote obesity, and the idea of syndemics, this prevalence of different disease clusters within the same community, which sort of aggregate, put the same two onto it and come up with this idea of toxic high streets. So in poorer communities, we get these clusters not only of kind of hot food, but other things like subprime financial services, which we know can be quite problematic. the more you're exposed to these. If you have poor financial management, the more likely it is you will take out loans one after the other, or more from various outlets all at the same time, which can lead to indebtedness. We have gambling exposure, and your likelihood to access these if you've got poor financial management again is an issue. And of course these lead on to things like poor mental health, and also can be linked to things like substance abuse. So you've got all of these kind of unpleasant things all happening kind of in the same place. The one thing I would say is that it's an incredibly complex issue, and there are no kind of quick fixes for this. So just to kind of go into some concluding thoughts, our built environments around us, and I say environments because obviously where we live, where we work, where we maybe spend our recreation time, they may all be quite different places, impact us and impact our health and well-being in a wide range of ways, and some of those are a little bit more obvious than others. I believe that creating healthier places must be a central aspiration for the future of our towns and cities. Some aspects of achieving that are actually well known, they're clear, they're supported by robust evidence. As I say, these issues around green space are very, very clear. Others are not so well researched. Issues such as, as I say, this oversupply of energy-dense, nutritionally poor food, and generally the future of our high streets is very, very challenging. To meet the challenge will require a kind of a step change in almost every aspect of the built environment. I believe it's possible, however, if the will is there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, and perfectly on time,
Thank you.
Very much appreciated. We have got time for a few questions. Hannah's got a mic because we need the mic for the live stream. And Claire, do we have any questions from online, from the Slido?
We do, I've just sent one through.
Okay.
How do LPAs tackle developers linking hot food takeaway elements within the guise of a restaurant? So, for example, the drive-through. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Tim, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so this is about how do local planning authorities basically tackle hot food takeaways which are disguised as other things, for example, restaurants and drive-throughs and these kind of things. It's incredibly difficult, and it's one of the problems. As I said, the planning system is a very blunt system. So when many people think about sort of hot food takeaways, we might be thinking of those sort of mainstream international companies that sell burgers and things. I don't want to be too specific. But they are often not in the hot food takeaway category at all. They quite often will come up as restaurants, which are A3, quite different, because they can afford to basically create places for seating, even if half of their, or more than half of their business they know will not be people coming in to sit down and eat. So it is a really, really tricky one. All I would say is that there are examples of where these things have been challenged, and I know they did it in North Tyneside, where again a fried chicken outlet was trying to say that it was creating a restaurant, but actually the local authority really knew it was a takeaway. So all I would say is I think there are opportunities to do this. It's about kind of learning from other authorities that have actually successfully challenged these things. I would say would be the best policy.
Thank you. Any other online? Any questions from in the room at all? Everyone's so shocked to actually be in the room. Go on, Nat. We'll just get the mic to you, Nat.
Hiya, that was really great to listen to you there, Tim. I'm Natalie Connor from Teesside Uni. You talked about how COVID-19 saw people want to engage with nature and be out there in green space. Do you think that's just something that was fleeting? or do you think that that is something that will prevail and that something will continue?
Yeah. No, I think what it highlighted was that innate need for people to have that kind of contact with green space. I think actually COVID-19, if there was anything sort of kind of positive that came out of it, it showed us that there are real deficiencies in the way that we've created our towns and cities over the past, kind of half century. So there's the lack of green space, and also that our homes are just hopeless. I mean, when you had to turn your home into somewhere where you weren't just living for part of the day, but it had to be, where you educated your children, where your children, spent their leisure time, where you spent your leisure time, etc., etc. Suddenly you realise that a lack of garden or a tiny little pocket handkerchief is not going to cut it, and you couldn't actually go to your local park because you only got that 1 hour to get out, and you couldn't get there and back in that time. These kind of issues. So, it highlighted several things, but that innate need for us to interact with nature, it's there. We are part of nature. We kind of forget about it because we live in such a sort of an artificial world that we forget that actually we're not a part, a distinct, separate entity. We're part of nature, and we do still need that interaction.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tim. And for those of you who have burning questions, Tim will be here, so you can nab a bit of coffee time. Okay, lovely.
Thanks very much, Amelia.
Thank you. Okay.
So putting health first means to recognise the power and the potential of planning in shaping the places and spaces that we live, work and play, and obviously experience in our daily lives as well. Should have gone there, go to the next screen. So events like COVID, as Tim has highlighted, still act as wake-up calls, if you like, to the disparities that we all experience and are influenced by the quality of the environment and we all live in. So I hope this opening image, powerfully portrays the theme of my presentation around disparities. So good morning, everyone. So I'm Michael Chang. I'm the program manager for Planning and Health at the Office for Health Improvements and Disparities. I can see that it's slightly slower changing live, so I think I will take my time in the transitions. So my presentation quite nicely builds on Tim's introduction to the various issues that we're experiencing through the planning system. My presentation focuses more on the practical elements of things. So how do you get things done? So knowing the evidence and knowing what you kind of have to do, what you need to do, how do you get the things done through the planning system and to help address issues like levelling up and the health disparities that we all want to tackle through our various research and work streams. So I think just taking a step back in terms of what we're going to do and talk about in my presentation. So I have 4 overarching themes that I'd like to kind of frame my presentation, but hopefully, in going forward, hopefully you take these 4 themes in the work that you do, so we all tackle it in a whole systems way, as Tim articulated. So firstly, looking at research evidence and data, is where many of you and other research institutions come in. Is there the evidence in the right format and the right subject areas and open access to them when needed to policymakers, practitioners? That's an open question that we need to constantly ask ourselves. Secondly, health and plan policy and guidance. Is there enabling regulatory and policy environments at multiple governmental levels, from national down to strategic, down to local and neighbourhood? Thirdly, health and planning decisions. Are there the right processes and structures for decision making to be made in the public interest, in the health interest? And then finally, capacity and capability. Do we have the right expertise in the right places and called upon at the right time to tackle the issues that we all need to address at a particular point in time or place? And I would argue that actually we do, and we are working within OHID a lot with external stakeholders as well as our internal policy team. So looking at expert stakeholders, research institutions, as Amelia said, we work quite closely with FUSE universities and other universities across England and the UK, other government departments and their agencies like Sport England, Natural England, Highways England, those agencies. The local systems, local authorities are our main target audience, if you like. And then obviously industry and private sector because they have a role in a market-led system that we have in the property industry here. And all of that, we have to address the needs of the community and different inequalities issues as well. So I think I want to illustrate this through an image that I used to use a lot, and I stopped using it, but I'll use it again in this particular event. This image of a development, and it's quite obvious it's not somewhere in the UK because of the palm trees at the front. But this is a completed development. Take it as a hypothetical development, and there may be issues around questionable design. It may not be the prettiest, the most beautiful design in the world, or at least in England. It may not be. There may not be any cycle infrastructure or active travel infrastructure. There may be a lack of green spaces that we would like that's functional and multifunctional for everyone. It may be a very unaffordable service, the gym. And there may be issues with physical inactivity of people using various modes of access that we wouldn't want them to use if they're able-bodied. But the planning system mediates many other issues as well. So it may not be the most beautiful building, but it may be an existing building. So it may be a retrofitting of an existing building. So therefore, there's a plus in the planning system. It may be co-locating a service, so it may not just be a gym, maybe other services within this structure that we may not be aware of, maybe other social services within the building, so therefore it's a plus. There may not be any cycle infrastructure, but then there will be other public transport services nearby that may be mitigating against the impact of the lack of active travel infrastructure, lack of green spaces, but there may be permeable surfacing on the floor to mitigate against climate change impacts. And again, looking at the access issues, those two gentlemen, they may have other hidden disabilities that we may not know about, and therefore they have to use the escalators rather than take the stairs. So this planning system, in a way, many different stakeholders involved in the system have to be able to mitigate and balance all these different considerations, and the outcome may not be the one that we're all happy with, but that's the kind of results. And our kind of job is trying to make sure that it's the most healthy and most equitable development possible, given all those considerations. I think Tim is very experienced in this area, and I highlight there is also an emerging body of research looking at the barriers and the challenges to why we're still talking about planning for health in 2022, even though back in 1919, the whole issue around the built environmental health began with the Ministry of Health. So 100 years later, we're still talking about it in terms of barriers and challenges. But most of the research around the barriers of planning system around health and well-being has actually been in the last 10 years, and mostly in the last 5 years, and they've all been focused around England, and therefore the research is highly relevant, highly practical, and we can transfer the lessons, if you like, across the country, rather than saying, well, that's European example, we can't do it here in England. But these research from a range of universities, including those from Newcastle and Teesside, Cambridge, and others, have found very similar challenges and barriers to why planning for health hasn't been working, isn't working, and may not work unless we address some of these barriers. So I'm hoping that in your research and the recommendations that you put forward as a result of your research can help address and unblock some of these challenges. And I can share these full references if you want to. There are about 15 of them in the last 5 to 10 years. And I think Tim was saying there are councils actually doing what they can within an existing planning system. So yes, we want to change the system to improve and block the challenges, but there are also councils, at the same time trying to do what they can with the existing powers and levers that they have in the local system. And again, drawing on those kind of 4 things around evidence, health and planning policies, health and planning decisions, and capacity and capability. They are good examples, and this book that's coming out in September will highlight many of these examples across England, but also internationally as well. So please look out for that. So, just to progress my presentation, then. So I think the kind of thing to think about is there are challenging issues that we had to deal with, and I think the last few months have really focused our minds in OHID, because we are looking at primarily addressing health disparities, and that's obviously the key mission of OHID going forward. And this quote from the movie that you have all seen the last few months, and it's obviously they have really nice quotes in this movie. There are things that potentially politicians and policymakers don't like and don't want to hear about, but that's why we're telling them they're really important. That's why researchers and practitioners, when we face challenges and we find issues that need tackling, we need to tell them in a way that's accessible, if you like. So the next series of three slides are all maps, and I think increasingly we have to show the issues in a way that allows us to take action and show them spatially is useful, backed up by obviously just numbers and graphs and tables, but showing them spatially can immediately focus our minds around how we level up the country and all these different issues as well. The first slide looking at the geographies of health, and you can have shown hundreds of slides looking at different maps and things around different health indicators. I'm picking out only 3 here. So there's male healthy life expectancy, aging population, the IMD deprivation indices, and you can clearly see, across the country there are pockets of areas that we potentially need to focus more of our efforts to support, and other areas they may be able to function just as well within existing levers they have. You can clearly see in this map there's a north-south divide, in some ways west-east as well. Pockets of concentration of these issues in coastal areas, rural areas, and I think the Chief Medical Officer's annual report last year around the coastal communities really should focus our research potentially in those areas that need our support. So potentially, yes, the metropolitan urban areas, but the coastal areas where there are these acute challenges as well. The next slide looking at a range of issues that we are trying to tackle in the planning system through housing primarily. The first slide is looking at an aging population. A research by Litchfields, the consultancy, found that actually the planning system across the UK haven't been allocating and planning for enough older people's housing to meet needs. I think only 5% of local plans allocate housing for older people, which is not great. So how do we tackle those issues? In the middle, there's always been a policy emphasis on brownfield development, and I think and brownfield sites have their benefits. They're closer to existing neighborhoods, existing services, and other issues. But they also have a lot of inherent challenges around health and environmental health. And so how do we maximize health on brownfield sites if they're the main policy for allocating sites for regeneration and development? And then thirdly, climate change. How do we adapt new homes to climate change? And those figures from the National Audit Office just shows you that some councils are facing the issues to a kind of more significant extent than others. So how do we tackle those issues? And then finally, an example, and we're talking about food a lot today, and I just happen to have used the food example because it's something that's a bit more developed in the way that we are tackling the issues. So how have we been using planning to manage the less healthy food environment? And this is particularly just around, again, just the fast food outlets. But I will say that we are looking at other retail users as well, dark kitchens, and as Tim said, drive-throughs and other retail. How do we manage them so they can be part of the whole healthier food environments? But anyway, this map shows you the narrative from the evidence that we've got around deprivation, heart disease, the density of fast food outlets, and I'm circling Blackpool in all these maps to show you, because there's a lot of folks on Blackpool from OHID and from government in the last few months. You can clearly see they do have some very challenging issues around health. But anyway, so Blackpool has the highest density of fast food outlets in England, by the way. So they have really some challenging issues around food environments. And then the final map shows you from Cambridge, from their census of local authority planning policies around fast food takeaways a few years ago. They mapped out where all these councils are in terms of those who have a fast food takeaways planning policy. And clearly see they kind of correlate. The ones they're darker across all 4 maps in some ways have a policy dealing with them. The ones that have lighter colors in terms of lesser health challenges have in some ways have no planning policies to tackle food environment because they don't have those issues. But clearly there are other areas that need to be taking action that are not taking action. So how do we support those areas as well? My point in this map is that actually, we have to be more nuanced in the way that we promote and put forward recommendations, because if we say councils with those really challenging health issues are not doing what they need to be doing, well, clearly from this Cambridge map on the fourth, on the right-hand side, the councils, Blackpool have a planning policy in SPD, other areas, Camden has a planning policy in SPD, but if you look at the bottom 10 of density fast food outlets, councils, they don't have one. And so, anyway, just to make sure that we're clear about exactly where we're targeting our recommendations and policy actions. The next kind of chunk is looking at policies and guidance. And I think this quote from a movie around rights, equality issues from the American Supreme Court Justice who passed away last year, I think. She said, protests, when this movie, protests are important, but changing the kind of issues means nothing if the law doesn't change. And I think for a system that operates primarily around the legislation and the regulatory environment, changing policies and law at the top level has to be the priority, as well as taking action on the ground as well. And there are clearly disparities in the planning system that we've got currently in the next slide, which will pop up very, very shortly. And the research by the Town and Country Planning Association back in 2019, and I would hope that someone could try and update these figures in 2022, 2023, is that a lot of the issues that we are facing around planning for health are not being addressed in a policy way in the local authority planning system. So the left two columns looking at whether local planning policies are linked to local health needs and health strategies. Only a quarter of councils do that. So that's about a quarter of 350 odd local planning authorities link their planning policies for the next 10, 15, 20 years to the local health needs and strategies. And then you can ask yourself, then if we're not planning for the health needs of the local area, who are we planning for? What about the other 3/4 of the councils? Who are they planning for in terms of the health of the population? The middle policy around design and health are really quite important, because this is where I'm slightly scratching my head here, because a lot of the councils do have planning policies around design, because that's a legal requirement in the Planning Act 2008. And the majority of them do link that to health and well-being to some extent. And you can clearly see North East has one of the highest percentage of local plans with design policies that are linked to health. But then if you look at the fourth box in terms of the design quality of housing, they are pretty much the poorest across England. So they have a very strong policy around design and health, but then they have very poor outcomes around the design quality of actual housing. Why that is, we can discuss in length around land values, but I think those are issues that we need to think about, whether policy and other issues need to come into play when we're addressing some of the health issues in the planning system. And I won't go through the financial contributions, because that clearly shows that majority of money secure from development is in London and South East. And you can say, well, in absolute terms, yes, because lower land values in the north means that you get a lower Section 106. But I think the point here is that there's less money to invest in some of these issues around health promoting infrastructure in the north, because in absolute terms the northeast gets less money than the other parts of the country, and because there's less growth as well in the north. So that's the system itself, but there are also disparities in the way that people working within a system view the planning for health agenda. And I know Fuse at Teesside have done some research around the planning inspectorate and other issues, looking at planners and other actors as well. And this slide shows you some quotes from some of the research as well. The firstly, house builders. Obviously, like I said, the market-led system, the house builders, they bring forward the sites, they put forward planning applications, and they build and they manage development. It's increasingly, but quite small percentage of councils and housing associations building housing, but it's still the minority. Most of the housing is still built by the private sector. And this quotes from the COCA review, more than 10 years ago, to say, house builders are not in business to serve the public interest. Their primary concern is to deliver profits, and it's still true. Having said that, there is a recent kind of a code for corporate bodies to say actually one of the objectives of corporate businesses is to, yes, meet the needs of the shareholders, but also for the wider society benefit. And I can forward you the link to that code as well if you're interested. So things have moved on a bit, but at the same time, house builders still hold much of the lever to delivering change. The second box on the right, looking at, like I said, planning inspectors, the adjudicators of the planning decisions, and this reads from Helen and Claire, looks at why the planning inspectorate is not making decisions that are helping the planning for health agenda, but then they're also good inspectors making good decisions as well, but they're not across the board. The third one around planners, yes, we had to appreciate the planners are there to do a job. They are there to mitigate and mediate against various different interests as well. And they just don't have the time to learn about public health. They need to be able to go through an issue fairly efficiently and effectively without needing to have a master's in public health. So how do we help them do that? And then finally, public health issues, again, skills and capacity, when they go into practice in local authorities, they're not able to work in planning like how we work in planning. So how do we upskill them in the future? And I'm just going to say many councils are actually recruiting, and I'll go to my next slide actually. Many councils are recruiting some of the issues into the teams, and I'll go through that secondly. So I think going forward, looking at the system itself, how do we improve the planning system? And there are opportunities to put health at the heart of the planning reform. And many of you will be aware of the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill that was published in the last week or so. And that should be the opportunity for us to be all involved in influencing the bill as it goes through Parliament. And how do we make sure that health is centered to the bill, but also the regulations that will follow afterwards. The National Planning Policy Framework will be revised, subject to the kind of passing of the bill in the next year or two. So, if you have any recommendations or policy changes, now is a good time to refine your recommendations. So when the NPPF is consulted on, in terms of the major update, you are ready to feed into it. Just going to say the NPPF will include new, quite detailed policies, and therefore many of the issues that we may want to get into the NPPF, like takeaways and health impact assessments, should be in the NPPF in the next iteration, hopefully. Thirdly, planning practice guidance. What additional guidance do we need to support the practice of planning for health? And then finally, how can local systems maximize the powers and levers, current powers and levers, to realize change? Because many of them are still using the current system, and they will do in the next year or two. So how do we support them in doing that? And amongst all of this stuff, how do we build in the Health and Care Act, which has just received royal assent, and the new NHS structures and their new duties into what we're doing on planning for health? Because the NHS is dealing with the planning system as well in terms of where they allocate sites for hospitals, GPs, pharmacies, and all those infrastructure, and they're also trying to secure Section 106 money. So in a way, we are fighting against against the NHS and fighting for that £7 billion. Section 106, how can we all work together to ensure a healthier society? My final block is before I finish off, is looking at the capacity and capability issues. And this quote from a very popular drama, 24, basically says, the politician says, it's he said, she said, this is politics, not medicine. Do me a favor and stay out of it. And the doctor responds, I am it. So I think that shows a point that the planning system is very much embedded in health and vice versa, and therefore we need to reflect that in the way that we work in the planning system. So this diagram shows you the planning system in the way that it operates in terms of how stakeholders get involved in it, from the planning inspectorate, local planning authorities, and other consultees who are involved in the planning process. So throughout the whole planning process, from playmaking to planning applications. And interestingly, if you look at the bottom right, the NHS is a consultee in the planning process, primarily in the playmaking process for local plans and neighbourhood plans. Not planning applications, but planning policies. So how do we get public health into that situation as well? But if you look at where public health sits, we are outside the system. We're not a consultee. Yes, we have moved into local authorities and unitaries, but in two-tier areas, the disconnect between counties and districts are still there. So how do we get directed public health and public health teams back, into the planning system in a more legal and formalized fashion? Because yes, the health can get involved in the system, but they have to fight their corner all the time. They're not automatically in the system like many of the other consultees, like Sport England and the new Active Travel England. So there's a commitment to future generations of the workforce as well. So looking at the skills issues, there's a commitment by the Royal Town Planning Institute, the Faculty of Public Health, and other stakeholder groups to improve the education around planning for health. The Royal Town Planning Institute has a 2022 presidential theme around health and well-being, and many of you have heard Tim Crawshaw a few weeks ago at a Northeast event. The Landscape Institute has a new competency framework that requires all landscape architects, park managers to meet a core competency around healthy places. So that's very encouraging. I would hope the RTPI and other built environment professional groups will have this new competency in the future. There's a health and well-being planning network that exists to bring practitioners together to share knowledge. But what about the career researchers? I think one of the key challenges that we have with the research community is that many of them do not understand the planning system, or they sit either in planning or public health. And I think, possibly not in the Northeast, but many other research that we've seen, they're just not able to do the research around planning for health that we can need them to do. So how do we support career researchers in their professional development as well? So finally, can I say where OHID comes in? So I think OHID is still very much developing. I'm hoping that the health disparities white paper will clarify the role of the built and natural environment and the work of planning in the whole public health system. And just to kind of finish off with a quote from the Secretary of State in his speech at Blackpool last year, that he wants OHID to work with whoever it takes. And that's what I'm doing, working with academia, the private sector, local authorities to effect change. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. We have time for one very quick question, either in the room if you're fast, or Claire, are there any on Slido?
Yeah, there's one on Slido. It says that hot food takeaway policy has the biggest impact on hot food takeaways that don't currently exist. So would it make much more sense to focus on those areas or local authorities with lower hot food takeaway density currently?
Michael, I don't know if you heard that or not. Did you pick that up? Oh, Michael, we have no sound from you.
There you go.
Right.
So about focusing on the lower density local authorities, is that right?
Correct.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think that's, I think, so are you speaking from an OHID perspective or local authority perspective? Because those councils who think they have no issue with fast food takeaways, they will say, well, there's no evidence to suggest that we need a planning policy in that area. And I think without the evidence to kind of show there is a problem, the planning inspector is not likely to approve that particular planning policy. From the OHID perspective, I think we can try and engage with those local authorities in the bottom half of that density map from PHE in 2018 and say, well, actually, the planning policy context is for the next 10, 15, 20 years. You may not have an issue in the next 5 years, but you may have one in 10 years. And therefore, having a policy in place will be useful. So that's a constant issue that we are having to tackle with those local authorities. But if they're not willing to bring forward a policy because it takes a long time, then we'll have to try other ways. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. Brilliant presentation. We've all really enjoyed it, and the technology kind of worked. So I will catch up with you later, Michael. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Good luck.
Okay, Mackenzie, would you like to come up? Now, we've not got a double act now, we've got a triple act, so bear with us as we dance about the lectern.
Good morning, everyone. As Amelia said, my name's Mackenzie. I'm a dietitian by background, and currently I'm a research fellow at the Applied Research Collaboration. And today I'm going to speak about work that myself and my colleague Steph from Newcastle did around consumer behaviours and experiences around enhanced takeaway services that were introduced during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm just going to start with some background information on different retailers within the hospitality food sector, which Tim has kind of also done. I'm just going to change the language around a little bit just for clarity, because the words takeaways are going to get thrown around a little bit. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to call the hot food takeaways fast foods. So historically, in line with town planning regulations, hot food takeaways do most of their trade through takeaways. So people get food to eat off premises. So that's on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we have our sit-down retailers. So these include things like full-service restaurants, pubs, bars, cafes. And most of the trade done by these sit-down retailers is from foods that are eaten on the premises. And before COVID, in line with town planning regulations, foods that were taken away were only supplementary. So takeaway services were very much a small portion of that business's profit. However, when we went into national lockdown at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the government announced changes to allow sit-down retailers to essentially act as fast food retailers. So they could earn a large capacity of their profit from actually selling foods to be taken away and eaten off premises. So this is a bit of a spoiler alert because I'm the first person to do this kind of trilogy, but our colleagues at Teesside did some focus groups with public health and town planning professionals. And what they found was levels of concerns that these changes might have on eating behaviours and population level obesity. So to complement their work, we at Newcastle conducted a complementary piece of work where we wanted to explore the intake of and the methods of accessing foods from these two groups of retailers, so our fast food versus our sit-down. We wanted to find out how people access those foods and also their experience of eating out during different phases of the pandemic. And as a secondary aim there, we wanted to look at the association between using these two different groups of retailers and socio-demographic characteristics. So just briefly on our methods, we did a longitudinal mixed methods study. So we did, not sure if you can see my mouse, you can. We administered a survey at 3 different time points, so T1, T2 and T3. And you can see we did them across different phases of the pandemic. So you can see we administered T1 that kind of aligned with the reopening of outdoor hospitality in mid-April last year. T2 we administered following the reopening of indoor hospitality mid-May last year. And then more recently, we administered our third survey in February, March this year, by which time there were no longer any legal limits on socialising. Our first survey, we collected background demographics, background habitual health behaviours, and then at every single survey we asked participants, how often did you eat from this group of retailers and this group of retailers in the previous 7 days, and how did you access those foods? We also ran 2 sets of focus groups. So our first one we did at T2, and then our second we did at T3, and we essentially wanted just to understand people's attitudes towards the changes to planning regulations and also their experiences of eating out. So just starting with our survey findings, these were our participants. So we had 701 complete the first survey. At time point 2 we had 615, so about 88% of the original sample. And then at T3 we had 490, so about 70%. So looking at weekly intake frequency, so starting with our fast food intake on the left, we can see mean weekly intake frequency was 0.96 times. For sit-down retailers, that was only 0.36 times. At time point 2, when indoor hospitality had reopened as well, fast food intake went up to 1.08 times. Sit-down intake went up quite significantly to 0.75 times. And then more recently, at our time point 3 earlier this year, weekly intake frequency from fast retailers stabilised at about 1.06 times. And again, we can see that stabilisation at sit-down retailers, so a mean intake of 0.71 times. So now looking at how people actually got those foods. So 82% of our participants said that they used those enhanced takeaway services to get food from sit-down retailers at least once since they were introduced since the start of the pandemic. When we look at just the 7 days preceding the surveys at those 3 time points, so starting with fast foods, we can see that the predominant method of accessing fast food was by far and away takeaway and delivery services in yellow and purple there. If we look at sit-down retailers, it tells quite a different story. So takeaway and delivery rates were quite low, somewhere between 6 to 10% across all 3 time points. By far and away, people use those dine-in services to get from sit-down retailers. We can see a marked increase at time point 2, where indoor hospitality had also reopened, and that was sustained at time point 3 early this year. So with our focus groups, our participants, we had 22 in total, which we ran across 6 online focus groups. We had a nice mix in terms of household income, gender and age. We also had one participant who was shielding at the time. That was a really interesting perspective to get. We had a number of themes come out, but just in the interest of time today, I'm going to take you through the 3 most salient ones. So firstly, the role of eating out versus the role of takeaway in people's lives. So eating out was really strongly linked to socialising. The food was kind of almost secondary, really. So eating out was very much about socialising, being with family, being with friends, special occasions, celebrations. Lots of people made mention that they missed getting up, and someone said, I have all these clothes and like nowhere to wear them. Takeaways, on the other hand, were very much related to convenience. It was very much about the food, really no mention of socialising, family or friends, and it was kind of trying to claw back kind of that time that you'd lose to food preparation and food work. Oh, we're missing a few slides, I'm sorry. So I'm going to do it from memory. The second theme related to people's experiences of eating out, and it was a real mixed bag. So some people had really negative experiences when they were eating out as kind of phased easing of restrictions was occurring. So some negative experiences related to the weather, if it was cold, if it was wet, things like wearing masks kind of suck the enjoyment out of, what should be kind of pleasant experience. But then on the other hand, we had people saying they really enjoyed it. They really enjoyed some of the adaptations that were being made by those venues. Things like using hay bales for outdoor seating, people really liked and they really wanted to kind of see continue. So we had kind of 2 camps, people who were saying, no, this isn't for me, I'm not enjoying myself, I'm just going to wait till kind of things are back to normal. And a second camp of people who said, actually, I really like these innovations, I'm happy to go out, like even though there's a pandemic going on. And then the third theme, let me just think. What was the third theme? Oh yeah, sorry. So related to that, the third theme was around kind of people's perceptions of safety and levels of fear and anxiety when going out to eat kind of during the pandemic. So we had a lot of people kind of saying, I don't know who's sitting next to me. Are they infected? Am I infected? Am I going to pass it on to them? Things like, is the restaurant doing the right thing? Is there ventilation? Are they wiping down the surfaces? And, kind of not wanting to cough and being kind of like exiled from the restaurant, that type of thing. With regards to the most recent round of focus groups we did, we haven't fully analysed them, but I can kind of share some initial findings with you. So basically that level of fear and anxiety that we saw during the first round of focus groups in summer last year was essentially absent now. People felt really safe in going to eat out, pretty much saying, it's not a concern, don't even think about COVID, it's all back to normal. Something that we also found was that people were kind of spoke favourably about the enhanced takeaway services. They said it was a great band-aid solution at the time. It supported businesses, it let us eat out from home, but there was kind of no need for them now. People said, I actually wouldn't really use them, wouldn't really cross my mind. Now that we can go out, we want to go out and we want to recapture the social experience of being out in a restaurant. So now looking at our intake by socio-demographic characteristics. So I'm sorry, this has jumped around a little bit. I'm not sure why that's something's happened there. But back to our survey data. So one of the things we found was that consistently across those 3 time points, younger people aged 18 to 24 ate significantly more from fast food and sit-down retailers than older participants. We found that people with food access issues, again, consistently ate more fast food than those without food access issues across all 3 time points. We found that carers ate 3.5 times more fast foods than those who weren't carers at that initial survey time point. We saw consistently that people with obesity compared to people with a healthy BMI ate from fast food retailers 1.6 to 2 point times more. And then lastly, we found that people with higher incomes ate from sit-down retailers 2.4 times more at that second time point when indoor hospitality had also reopened. Well, there's the slides that I couldn't find. So everyone commit them to memory with your photographic memories. So just briefly on considerations for practice and policy. So we saw really strongly that the use of these different retailers was socioeconomically patterned. So mainly we saw that really enduring trend that people with food access issues use takeaways much more frequently than people without food access issues. We identified groups that were higher consumers of fast food. So again, this enduring trend that we saw at all 3 time points, that younger people, people with food access issues and people with obesity used fast food retailers much more than their counterparts, and we didn't see that for sit-down retailers. And thirdly, we saw that delivery services were really commonly used to access fast food, where dine-in was virtually non-existent. So now that we're kind of seeing this, real increase in things like Deliveroo, Uber Eats, we need to firstly consider what is the implication of that on fast food intake, but also ultimately, if these delivery services are going to continue, that potentially is going to undermine town planning and regulations to try and prevent proliferation of takeaway outlets. So we need to be looking at policies that are trying to improve the healthfulness of the menu offers. How am I going for time? I'm done. Okay, so this I think was a little overly ambitious anyway, but happy to discuss limitations and strengths in question time. So I'll wrap up there, and just to say thank you to our funders, collaborators and partners listed here. Thank you.
Thanks.
So we're just going to do some questions at the end of our 3 presentations. I'm really hoping mine are in order, so I'd bear with if they're not. So Amelia and I are going to do a quick presentation on a couple of projects that we've been doing, all of which are under the umbrella of hot food takeaway applications. So healthy planning, today we're going to talk about training and planning appeals and how we can take this work forward. So to summarise, local authority, public health and planning teams about 2 years ago we were talking to Public Health England about needing help to implement the healthy weights guidance that they had from Public Health England, which is now OHID. And a solution to this was that PHE put out a tender asking for help to develop a CPD package that would facilitate the implementation of their guidance. So the background to this is, as we've discussed this morning already, the environments that we spend our daily lives influence what we eat, when we eat, and where we choose to eat. And there is a lot of academic evidence that there are barriers to effective working between health professionals and planning professionals. So there's difficulties at translating evidence from health into planning and supporting policy decisions at a local level. Now, there are some existing training and guidance stuff out there. However, what we found is that these programs tend to have healthier food environments as an element of the training rather than as the focus of them. So this project team here, this wonderful gallery of faces, got together and applied to work on this project. Tim Frontier led the project from Newcastle. We worked with a colleague from Arup, Erin, and there were 5 colleagues from Teesside, Amelia, myself, Michael, Claire and Hannah. And we started this work, it feels like yesterday, but it was actually in June 2020. And what it involved, it was quite an ambitious programme for 9 months work, but we started off by collating some evidence around the health and planning literature, looking at what people offered for training and guidance, and looking at local level, see what was happening there. From that point, we carried out a 2-stage Delphi survey and a questionnaire with our local authority colleagues. We then looked at some more of the points in depth with some follow-up interviews just to provide a solid foundation for the training that we designed, and then finally we actually designed some training modules. So briefly, we found that there is a clear momentum to try and bring planning and public health projects together. There are issues, but the people that we spoke to believed that they were not insurmountable. And everybody that we spoke to was very interested and very aware of these issues. There is very limited CPD training available at the time, and we found that there was an awful lot of evidence for people wanting to access this kind of training, but that they really wanted to be accessible and flexible, so it wasn't on a particular day or a particular time. People could access it in their own when it suited them. And the evidence did point to the need for us to develop some training. So we have a 5-week course. It is all developed. We OHID are currently looking for a hosting platform to run it on. And this follows, there's an introduction, there's some planning for public health people, there's some food environment work for planners. Then the module looks at actions and approaches for healthier food environments, and then how to make the evidence work. We have a report if anybody's really interested in looking at it, and we are developing an academic paper summarising our work, and hopefully, fingers crossed, the training will be available for people to use soon. I'll hand over to Amelia.
Thank you. Okay. I'm well aware that I'm standing between everybody and coffee, and for those of you at home, I'm standing between your wandering to the fridge to take a chunk of cheese, as our Prime Minister said last week. But anyway, moving on from that. I'm going to talk about a piece of work around the planning appeal system. So Michael alluded to that when he was presenting. And this was a piece of work funded by NIHR School of Public Health Research. Today's event and some subsequent events are going to be related to this piece of work and disseminating this work, so more on that later. But as you can see, there was a lot of people, and that's really important because we worked not just with policy and practice, but also with members of the public, because members of the public have been involved in these appeals, for example, against large American branded franchises who have taken these appeals have then gone very viral, so to speak. Yeah. So the aim of this work was around exploring and examining the National Planning Inspectorate decision making in relation to hot food takeaways. So, for those of you not familiar, if somebody applies for a hot food takeaway, so it would be a new or a change of use, and a local authority said no and gave their reasons for that, the person who put that application in, if they are unhappy with that no decision, they can then make an appeal, and that goes to an independent body called the National Planning Inspectorate. Okay, so there are lists of these appeals on a database, and we looked at appeals from 2015 to 2020. We kicked off this work right as COVID impacted us, so there were some impacts on the study in terms of not being able to speak to businesses and people in public health being a little bit busy with something else, but we powered on, and we managed to find 47 cases. Almost 50-50 were upheld or dismissed. Then we narrowed it down to 8 cases that we could really take a deep dive into, and by deep dive that meant talking to people as well as doing really in-depth documentary analysis. And we have got some findings. I don't have a huge amount of time to talk about the findings today, but we will have a paper from this and a report that will be live soon. But just to give you a flavour of the work, when we spoke to a range of professionals from planners through to public health teams as well as environmental health officers, there were a number of themes that came out very strongly. At the core of these were communication, and again, Michael's alluded to this, Tim's alluded to this, but we've all talked about this need to communicate across the professional groups, and that understanding and importance of health. So even when we looked at those appeals cases that were around hot food takeaways, only a very small proportion of them had health as a major factor within that. I believe it was 3, and I believe within 5 of them health was a secondary factor. So there was a lot of evidence, around wanting user-friendly evidence, and that importance of quantitative evidence. People talked about the use of the National Child Measurement Programme data, which gave an indication of childhood obesity rates in their areas, and the importance of being able to access that data and knowing where that data was, as well as knowing where locally relevant data was. So lots of work around local authorities making it easy for their staff to find where that data is, and staff having the capacity to do that bringing together of the data. So just to summarise, and we want to build on these recommendations, and that's part of the next phase of this dissemination work. What we found is around dealing with these time-intensive appeals, the important factors were around communication between professionals, knowing where to find the data and sharing the data, understanding the evidence and understanding the importance of health, having systems that are updated, and to develop and build on the enthusiasm and passion of staff that are really interested in driving forward this healthy planning agenda. So just to re-emphasise what we have said so far this morning, there's this need to reunite and for professionals to work together, and we have many examples where this is happening. And following the break, we'll have Lucy Greenfield from Gateshead giving a really good example of where there is that coherent approach. So moving forward, so today is part of our successful Impact Acceleration Award, which is around taking forward those findings from the planning appeals work. So we want to work with people who are in this room and people who are joining us online or people who watch it later to create a really practical, useful how-to guide. So after this event, if you've signed up for it, you'll get an email asking you to give feedback, and on that you can indicate if you're interested or not. If you're watching this at another time, feel free to contact myself or Helen to express your interest in this. We want to say a huge thank you. Thank you to our funders, the School of Public Health Research, and a thank you to Fuse. And we have just got time for some very quick questions, and you can direct those to Mackenzie, Helen, or myself, or if you're in the room, you can catch us at coffee time. So do we have any in the room, or Claire, do we have any online?
We've got one online, which is quite an interesting question. It's one we've been trying to answer, and it says, do you have any idea about the number of outlets that decided to operate within the amending planning regulation?
Haha. Okay, that was a question around COVID, and I think that alludes to the, as Mackenzie said, Newcastle looked at the consumer behaviour, and the team at Teesside, we looked at what was happening on the ground, both in terms of the professionals and also in terms of what was happening in the outlets. Not just team at Teesside. Tim was involved with our Teesside team, but you're an adopted Teessider. Just what happens. So we tried very hard. We were looking around the northeast of England. We were trying to see how many outlets were operating as takeaways, and there was very little evidence of anybody recording the number that were moving from, say, restaurant only to takeaway, because public health teams and local authorities were rather busy, and whilst it was mandated that they do that, there wasn't time to put systems in place, and it didn't happen. And there will be a paper coming out very soon in Perspectives in Public Health on that. So yes, good question. But the answer is we don't know, and I don't think we ever will know. But Lucy might be able to answer more of that later. Any other questions in the room or online? Fantastic, we have made it to coffee time. Those of you that are joining us online, we have a refreshment break. Please amble your way to your fridge and your coffee machines or your office fridges, and we will be back online at 11:30 with part 2. Thank you very much. And I'll introduce Lucy. There she is. Hello, Lucy. Introducing Lucy, who is our planning officer from Gateshead Council. So we're really pleased to have you this morning, Lucy, and the floor is yours.
Brilliant, thank you. So yes, as just said, I'm Lucy Greenfield, and I'm a planning officer at Gateshead Council. Just checking because there's a bit of delay. I'm getting distracted because I can kind of see myself on a different device. So yeah, I'm trying not to get distracted by myself. So just a quick background into the origins of planning. Planning was kind of developed because of public health, and that link between public health and planning has been a long-standing situation. It's not anything new, although sometimes we might have forgotten about it through history. So I've got just a quote there about how, you know, health and planning are entirely intertwined and should be seen as such, and those links are further verified through the National Planning Policy Framework. So whether or not health should be a day job as a planner, I've been a planner quite a long time, which is quite scary to think, and I've been at a number of different councils, and whether or not health is part of our day job or not is something that needs to be discussed, I suppose. Health and planning, as I've said, are intertwined in multiple ways. Delivery of homes, air quality, active travel, open spaces, healthy food, all needs to be considered with health as part of that broader picture. But it's not often an actual specialism in planning. You have specialists and planning teams in economy or in minerals and waste, but you don't often have a health specialist. And what the best way of doing this is I suppose it's horses for courses in different teams. So in our team in Gateshead now, I am the health specialist in the planning policy team, but there was not a health specialist in any other council that I've worked at. And I think there's pros and cons of both. But I think the key thing is that you work with other departments. You don't work within your silo within public health, within planning policy. You work with public health, you work with environmental health, and whoever else you need to get the job done correctly. But having health as a specialism and labelled as such, and somebody designated as a health specialist, kind of ensures that the profile is kept high and is considered, and there's effective planning policies developed with health in mind. In terms of our planning policy teams, this is just a quick list of what I would think success looks like in planning policy if you're considering health properly. So first of all, I've mentioned already collaboration. So that's collaboration with public health teams and environmental health teams and whoever else you need to consult within the council and externally as well. New ideas, not just churning out the same old planning policies time and time again, thinking what else can we do? And that's linked with added value and ambition. You know, what we've got a planning policy here, it might not obviously have anything to do with health, but what can we add to this policy to make better health outcomes? Co-benefits. I talk about this an awful lot at the moment because I'm a specialist in health and planning, but also climate change, and the co-benefits between climate change and health are plenty, and making sure you kind of make the most of that. So that can be in terms of evidencing a policy. So say, for example, it's a policy on active travel. You've got the benefit of improving health, but also combating climate change and also improving air quality. So you can use that as a multiple justification for having that policy and having the evidence base behind it. But also you can use that for bidding for funding at any point as well, that there's multiple reasons for doing any one intervention. Front loading, so this is making sure health is considered right at the beginning of any plan making process, whether that's making a local plan or in deciding planning applications. So just discussing it at pre-application stage, just making sure that it's on your radar early on. Having good evidence and thinking outside of the box in terms of evidence. So planners are quite stuck in their ways a lot of the time, and we have our standard housing evidence and whatnot, and we don't often think of other types of evidence that might be out there. But when you're looking at health, you need to consider evidence from other sources that you might not necessarily naturally go to as a planner. Health impact assessments. This is something at Gateshead we do as part of our plan making process in our sustainability appraisals, but just ensuring you have that in plan making as well as at planning application stage as appropriate. Looking at the bigger picture, an example here being obesity is our business. Often we don't necessarily realise as planners that all these different health disparities is our business. And you might not think that planners have anything to do with obesity, but we do. There's multiple ways that we can influence obesity, whether that's through food environments or active travel, and it's everyone's business essentially. Know your patch. So depending where you are, what local authority you work in, or multiple local authorities, you'll have different health issues. There's obviously recurring themes. Most places have obesity issues, but there might be specific issues in your local area, whether that's high levels of depression or heart disease, ageing population, and addressing that appropriately. With the planning reforms that are going ahead, there's going to be an even bigger emphasis on having locally specific policies. There's going to be a lot more at the national level that's more generic. So what you have at a local level needs to be specific. So if you've got specific health issues in your local authority or parts of your local authority, that could be a justification for having a specific policy around that. And evidenced outcomes. So monitoring, we love to monitor as planners. So having improved health is a monitorable outcome, or reduced inequality, or whatever it is, but just monitoring where you've got to really with how effective your policies are. So I'll give you a whistle-stop tour of an example of health policy at Gateshead Council. We've mentioned hot food takeaway policy earlier on in the day, so I'll just talk a little bit about ours at Gateshead. And I've got there my list of what success looks like, and which ones I think were covered in producing this hot food takeaway supplementary planning document, and then implementing it. So collaboration there, we wrote this SPD in collaboration with public health, environmental health, the legal team, our economic development team, and planners, both in the planning policy team and also development management. So it was very much a multi-team approach. We all brought our various insights into the process, and all worked very well together. And now going forward, myself and the public health team work on a very regular basis. We meet multiple times a week on various different issues, which is something I understand is fairly unique to Gateshead. A lot of different councils that I speak to very rarely speak to their public health colleagues. And sometimes I have public health colleagues from other councils phoning me up saying, how do we talk to planners? How can we engage the planners? So yeah, it's important to get those working relationships up and running, and making the most of them. New ideas. So this SPD was, to my knowledge, the first planning policy in the country to use obesity as a reason for refusal on planning applications, and it has been used as the sole reason for refusal. So where obesity levels are of a particular level, I'll go on to what that is in the next slide. We have used that as a reason for refusal on a planning application. So I think we were the first to do that. Evidence, and again, thinking outside the box with your evidence. So for this document, we use the National Child Management Programme, which is something that wasn't used previously for planning. And another example there is a food sampling survey. So we did a survey of all of our hot food takeaways in Gateshead, and did a nutritional analysis. I say we, it was obviously somebody who has those expertise, but it was unequivocal that the hot food takeaway offer in Gateshead was in fact unhealthy and extremely unhealthy. So that was part of our evidence, which is not your typical planning policy evidence, I have to say. Looking at the bigger picture, the example of obesity there, and evidenced outcomes. So we monitor how many hot food takeaways we have in Gateshead. We obviously have obesity monitored, and we monitor the success of the planning application process. So yeah, there's just a bit of a snapshot in terms of the SPD, and Gateshead. So Gateshead is obese, above national average. We have more takeaways than the national average. Our takeaways have been proven to be unhealthy, and we have high levels of health inequality in Gateshead. So what we've got in terms of our policy, we have a local plan policy, which is up here, which is CS14 on wellbeing and health. And part of that broad policy, we say we're going to control the location of and access to unhealthy eating outlets. And then we wrote the supplementary planning document in the same year to give further detail on that. And what that detail is it gives a description or a series of criteria to assess whether or not a location is appropriate for hot food takeaways within Gateshead. And locations that aren't appropriate are those within a 400-metre radius of secondary schools, youth centres, leisure centres and parks. So essentially where young people might congregate. It's not suitable if the location is in a ward that is obese, and that's raised, right, well, it's the target is 10% obesity or less, using the National Child Measurement Programme at year 6. That target was a target the council had set prior to us writing this SPD. And it's obviously a very ambitious target, but it was based on Gateshead aspiring to have the lowest obesity rates in the whole of the country. So yeah, that's what we stuck to, because that was a politically agreed target. Another location where it might be unsuitable is if there's an over-proliferation of takeaways, and this is based on ward level compared to national average. And the final one there is over-concentration. So within a retail centre or retail frontage set of shops, you have to have less than 5% of your total frontage being hot food takeaways, and you can't have more than 2 consecutive hot food takeaways in any given parade of shops. This wasn't the intention when we wrote the SPD, but currently, as a result of all those criteria, no locations within Gateshead are suitable for hot food takeaways. So essentially, when anyone ever applies for a hot food takeaway in Gateshead, you're going to get your planning permission refused. And this is just an example of that. So the first part of the graph is the takeaways, the applications for takeaways prior to the SPD getting adopted, and those afterwards. We've had all hot food takeaways refused. The approval you can see on that graph is, I believe, a change in planning conditions on an application that had already been approved prior to the adoption of the SPD. We've had 100% of our planning applications refused since the SPD was adopted. And this is our appeals. So as previously mentioned earlier today, if somebody's not happy with their decision on their planning application, you can appeal. And we've been successful at every single one of our appeals, and that includes some multinational companies that we've been successful at those appeals as well. And interestingly, on the previous slide, the total number of hot food takeaway applications has reduced, and I think that's because people are aware of the policy and aware of what the outcome's likely to be, and also from pre-application advice. We've seen a lot fewer applications in total. So this is just a bit of an overview of the outcomes. Like I've said, 100% success in refusing applications and success at appeals, overall reduction in the total number of applications, and we're seeing a slow reduction in the total number of takeaways that exist. So obviously the policy doesn't have any influence on existing premises, but as there's a general like a natural churn of uses, the number is slowly going down in Gateshead, which is fantastic. But sadly, obesity is still rising, and that's not unique to Gateshead, but it's something just to be aware of, that we know that this policy isn't the the answer to all of our woes. It's just part of a bigger picture. In terms of lessons learnt from producing this SPD, it's already been mentioned, this policy only applies to hot food takeaways. It doesn't apply to other sources of unhealthy food, of which there are plenty. Shops, just at the supermarket, you can get plenty of unhealthy food, cafes and restaurants. So this SPD doesn't control those. Dark kitchens, I think there's a presentation after mine on dark kitchens, so I won't talk too much about this, but the supplementary plan document doesn't have an influence over those. It doesn't impact on existing premises, and there's a need for a robust evidence base, and you need to make sure that's up to date, because even though your SPD or your planning policy is adopted, planning applications and appeals are ongoing, and an inspector will look at those, the evidence behind that, and if it's not up to date, you could get challenged. And then a bit of a food for thought in terms of the planning reform. Do we want to include health impact assessments and equality impact assessments within that planning reform, and whether that should be a nationally set standard for local planning authorities, something to consider at the national level. We've already mentioned, I've not actually got a slide on this, but I'll just mention it because it's of interest from one of the previous applications and presentations rather, in terms of what we're doing since COVID and hot food takeaways. The changes in the legislation which allowed restaurants and pubs to use a takeaway service ended earlier this year, and we notified all of our premises in Gateshead, all of our food premises of this. We sent out letters, and we made visits, and we're also partway through a survey of all of those premises to see how many did use that takeaway provision, because technically everyone who did so was meant to notify the council, but we were well aware that very few people did, but lots of premises were using that facility. So we wanted just to get a better picture of how many were and how many had planned to continue, or just generally a flavour of what changes they've seen since COVID in terms of people's behaviours, their customers' behaviours, whether they are more likely to request takeaway food, and whether their demand has changed in terms of healthy food options, vegan options, low carbon options, etc. So it's quite a detailed survey we're doing of all of our premises. So we'll share those results once we get those back. So what more can we do for health in planning policy? So this is my final slide. It was kind of a bit of a brain dump of all the different things we can do. I've mentioned already about co-benefits. So you can upsell, not that you should have to, your policies on health, because they link to climate change, air quality, green infrastructure, biodiversity, to name but a few. 20-minute neighbourhoods, something that we can consider in planning policy terms. Learning from COVID, as Tim already mentioned, through COVID, people realised that where they lived weren't necessarily the best environments, and what was important to people might have shifted slightly, and that accessibility to open space, accessibility to a good range of shops, and having that sense of community was more important, and people became aware that was more important to them. So it's kind of given us a bit of a impetus to look at 20-minute neighbourhoods in more detail, which we're doing at Gateshead, and that very much links to climate change as well, in reducing the need to travel. Added value, what else can we do for health? Each time we're looking at planning policy, having a think, what else can we do to make health and health inequalities better in Gateshead or wherever you may be, and also shining a light on mental health. What can planning policy do for mental health? And particularly green infrastructure is something that very much can benefit people with mental health issues. And as I've said before about inequality, there's no point in putting in some infrastructure for a cycle lane, which is only going to help those who are already physically active. You're not addressing inequality that way. So you need to make sure you're considering that. Health impact assessments. Just another food for thought, really. Can these be incorporated into at the national planning policy level in greater detail in terms of requiring those during planning policy preparation? And finally, just remember who you're planning for. So when you're a planner, we're planning for people and people's well-being, and we should always remember that.
Do we have a bit of time for questions? Have we got any in the room or on Slido? Claire?
Yeah, we've got one online, and it asks Lucy, how did she become a health specialist? I think this is coming from people working in local authorities. Do you have any advice for those people to be a bit more proactive in this area?
It's something that kind of naturally happened for me. So I've always I was the more touchy-feely planner, I suppose. I've always been in sustainability and climate change and that side of things. And through my work in sustainability appraisals, health has been part of that, and looking at the social aspect of planning. So that kind of, made me the natural choice in terms of being a health specialist. And then it's just been in-job experience more than anything, working with public health and public health colleagues, and doing CPD relating to health. So no special qualification as such, just CPD.
Question, I think, on Slido.
Yeah, there is another one. Do you evaluate health impact assessments in terms of whether the finished development reflects what they said they were going to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of the health impact assessments on that we do through planning policy preparation, yes, it gets monitored using the indicators and through our annual monitoring reports. And then in terms of planning applications, again, they do get assessed, but maybe it's more of a resourcing issue in relation to enforcing that going forward. So yes, they do, but maybe they can be done more effectively if we have more resources.
That's great. Thank you very much, Lucy. So I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce my colleague. Nick works with me in the Impacts and Evaluation team in the School of Social Sciences. Nick's interests are around regional governance and labour markets. And he's going to do a talk for us on levelling up.
In towns and cities. I still forget I'm Dr. Nick Gray. Hasn't been very long. I feel like a bit of a rogue economic geographer, but I'm going to talk about kind of a broad sweep of, well, not a broad sweep, but it's kind of the regional policy context, urban and regional policy context, and that thing we're calling levelling up. I'm going to think about what it might mean for planning, what it might mean for, or what it means for urban regeneration, urban development, and the way our towns and cities and counties are governed, and maybe some context for what that means for us trying to create better places, better towns and cities, good cities, better lives. Always lever in that, as Peter Hall said. I'll go everywhere with this slide. Regional policy. This is the traditional business of regional policy, and that's GVA per capita. I shan't explain the detail, but it's quite striking. It's after 70 to 100 years of regional policy in England, there's Durham and Tees Valley where we are now, compared to the former regions of the DDR. You can see that their economic growth trajectory is somewhat different to ours, where we are today. But I just thought I'd set that scene. That's the traditional business of regional policy. So today we have levelling up. There's some levelling up missions. That's a distillation of them. There's 12 of them. The top one there, boost productivity, pay jobs. That's the usual regional policy stuff. Spread opportunities, improve public services. That was the one that rang alarm bells for me, because once you're starting to talk about, well, levelling up's about improving public services, what's it not about? Surely that's the business of government, to improve public services. And actually, if you look at their levelling up missions in detail, they cover pretty much most of the domestic business of government, other than transfer payments, other than social security. So what's it not? Never mind. Sense of community and local pride. We'll think about that a bit later in the context of urban regeneration and empower local leaders. That's essentially local government reform. That's the levelling up bill, or the levelling up white paper talks about these things. I'm going to think about it a little more regional policy context, going to distill that out a bit. And I've identified some ingredients here and imaginatively illustrated them with a pot of ingredients. Some literal thinking for you there. And levelling up, infrastructure and regeneration, we're going to think about that today. Government job rotation, we're not. Planning reforms, yes, we'll give that a bit of thought. Industrial policy, no. Research and development, no. Changing of scales in towns and the change of governance, they're the kinds of things. So I've got 3 more slides. We're going to think about planning, we're going to think about urban regeneration, and the way our towns are governed and what that might mean for making them better, healthier places which promote well-being. Have I skipped 2 there? No, I haven't. It's not your fault either. So urban regeneration in levelling up. As some of you know, we've had the Towns Fund, Levelling Up Fund, Future High Street Funds, there's other funds kicking about. Typically high street regeneration and transport projects. I've illustrated this with Redcar's project. It's a bit of a parochial presentation. I prefer to call it place-based. So that's Redcar Town Centre. There were some good things going on there. All of the towns and all the local authorities in Tees Valley have got their own towns funds. Some of them got Future High Street Fund. Stockton are talking about greening the town centre. Middlesbrough are talking about repurposing retail to leisure. There's all kinds of things going on. This is done through competitive funding pots, often for time-limited projects, sometimes with controversial winners. And I think it's not controversial to say that the National Audit Office did a particularly damning report of the Towns Fund, which you can read. It doesn't pull punches. Subsequently, Levelling Up Fund's got a bit more better organised. And as I say, typically high street regeneration. The governance of our towns and cities. I don't know who these characters are. I don't know how they got on there. Obviously, it's Ben Houchin, Metro Mayor for Teesside, and the other fellow. For years now, since the coalition government, there's been emphasis on functional geographies. I don't know why I'm looking there when it's on there. Metro mayors governing at the broader scale to do possibly planning. There was a lot of talk when LEP's first appeared. Well, LEP's going to do planning and start to do strategic things. More recently, with levelling up, we've quietly leaned towards local government with funding allocations. And these funds I just talked about in the previous slide, with the Towns Fund, the Levelling Up Fund, they're directed towards local government. Local government officer in Tees Valley said to us on a meeting we had, well, we've never had as much money, and that's after a lot of years of austerity. They've had control of a lot of money. And alongside that, there's a bigger role for MPs in these regeneration debates. So they need to be backed by a local MP. And maybe I'll reflect upon that, what that might mean, in a couple of slides' time. My planning slide's gone. My planning slide has actually gone. I'll wing it. I did check. I said it was all there. I was just nervous. There's planning in the Levelling Up Bill. Came out last week. Now, there was a lot of talk prior to that, and my slide has a picture of Boris Johnson with build, build, build on his lectern. So there's a lot of talk about zonal planning, deregulated planning, let's get building, let's get build everywhere. That hasn't happened. And maybe reflect on that a second. From our perspective in the room today, that's not a bad thing. And that's what we've got in the planning element in the Levelling Up Bill, is an emphasis. There's lots of tinkering, things which are not clear what's going to involve, things like street votes on developments, It might be easy. They're talking about it making it easier for councils to do compulsory purchase orders. What I'm not sure what that's going to involve. I'm presuming there's planners still on the line who would be able to tell us more about that. What else is in there? It's votes on street names, protecting street names. There's going to be beauty standards for towns. Some interesting, but fairly tame things. So in a sense, we may have dodged a bullet on planning reform. So pulling these together, what are the good things? Well, as I've just said, radical planning into regulation probably isn't necessary. Zoning places say you can do what you like in it. Investment in our towns is welcome. I think after, like the local authority officer said, for many years we had no money. We've never had as much money. There's some very capable people, and I'm conscious there might be some local government people here, but I was one. Very capable people in local government are bidding for these funds, and they're implementing valuable projects. And councils will try to weave these projects into longer term strategies. At the same time, calling back to the other things I was talking about, in terms of urban regeneration, we've got different funding streams, towns fund, levelling up funds, this, that and the other. They're operating through different institutions, sometimes combined authorities, sometimes local authorities, at different spatial scales, are they at the combined authority level or at the local authority level? That's a bit confusing. They come in the form of deals controlled from Whitehall and requiring Whitehall approval for the projects that you want to do on your patch, including the approval of the local MP. Now, Whitehall politicians, whether that's ministers or your local MP, might have one eye on the next general election and thinking a lot more about pride in place and hanging baskets and doing places up than they are maybe long-term strategies to create a better place. And alongside that, places are competing for funding on the short-term funds, bit of a beauty contest. You're trying to bring money in, telling Whitehall what it wants to hear. So bringing them together, I'd argue that while there's some good things going on, if we're thinking about planning and regeneration and creating better towns, better places, healthier places, the system we've got at the moment, the way we're doing the funding, it's not ideal for long-term aspirations to design better places. If you're bidding into short-term competitive funding pots, you've got Whitehall influence. It's not necessarily ideal for cooperation across local authority boundaries. Again, places are competing. These things are being done at the local level. And if we think about, if we want to reduce car use, car dependency, that would be a healthy thing, and making it easy for people to choose to not drive. If we don't have that one broader urban area that we're looking at to plan, and we're building, the employment site at that end of the bypass, and the housing estate at the other end of the bypass, and wagging our fingers at people who don't drive, though, it's not really going to happen. And I'd argue there's better to have more freedom at the local level, obviously calling for a bit more flexibility and devolution, and working at the right level, whether that's at the broader area or the local area, working in cooperation rather than competition, when we're doing, and have transparent funding for these projects, rather than what can be a highly politicised structure, highly politicised process. I've probably sped through that. There's some other things there I wanted to say, but I can cover them in the many questions.
Thank you so much.
Do we have any questions in the room? Because I think we haven't got, you've stunned the people online into absolute quiet. Anybody in here wants to pose a question? Oh, I've got a couple.
Tim first.
Thanks, Nick. Sorry. I was just wondering whether you've got any examples of that kind of cooperation across local authority boundaries that you were thinking was so positive.
That would be so positive. If we were thinking about the duty to cooperate, which has been scrapped now, I believe, I'm deferring to you as a plan. I don't have any. I mean, things which have happened at the combined authority level.
to the mic, please.
If we think about the combined authority level, if I look at Tees Valley, I mean, for all, I'm not going to stand here today criticising Ben Houchin, but there's no sense, for example, Teesside is a place. He's very much, he heads a grant coalition, and his job is to bring that money in to different places, and there's not a sense that the combined authority and the mayoral combined authority is governing a place as a whole, and there's enough spatial planning is the term used, which is it's not fashionable. Well, it probably is in academia, and I don't see a lot of it in the northeast. I see a lot of people want their pet projects in their area and they want to win votes. You might be able to put me right.
Thanks, Nick. Interesting presentation. Just, I suppose, as you were talking, all I got the sense of is, thinking about this in practicality and what you've just answered to Tim. It's so kind of politically driven at this. How can it rise above the politics and actually serve the people? That this is what this is supposed to do. What's the answer for it to not be people's pet projects?
I mean, don't get me wrong. Some of the things which are going on. Stockton's a really interesting example of this park they want to do in the town centre. There's lots of people working in local government, doing good things. So it isn't that this isn't serving the people. It's more that's not ideal at the strategic level. I think I wanted to get across there. Particularly when we're talking about, I think motor car use is a good example. And the way we've planned Tees Valley. Actually I think it might have been on my missing slide, I had a picture of the A66, it might have been, which is driven through Teesside. It's horrific. And obviously we've done it now, we have to live with it. But it's kind of not thinking about, we're still planning around the car.
Is there time for that?
Yeah, there's time for one more.
Planning around the car and inequality. So all of this around the framework of inequalities, Nick.
Thanks for this. Yeah. I mean, I should have a handy statistic on the percentage of people in Teesside who don't own a car. But I don't. It's quite high though. So what's the answer to how to not plan around the car?
Well, I suppose where the place Teesside goes, that we know that that's a place of high inequality. So all of this Towns Fund, all of this, is this going to change our deprivation?
No.
What is then?
To transform the northeast and Teesside, I think you probably need something akin to a Marshall Plan. I think the path dependencies, the kind of the history of the problems we've got, aren't going to be solved by scattering 20 million projects around and saying there's levelling up. And I don't want to get too political about it, but I think we need considerably more resource done in a much more concerted fashion over a very long time with stable institutions. We've had, sorry, I can go off on one now. We've had, for many years of regional policy, we change our institutions, we have something new, we try something new. We had New Labour's regionalism, and we had cities and local growth, which is all about urban agglomeration. And now we've got levelling up, which is about who knows. So, more money managed through stable, place-based institutions. I mean, things like, we're going to have regional directors on levelling up directors. We used to have government offices for the regions, the same sort of thing. But we scrapped them, so it's more churn, but now we're bringing them back. So, I'm sure of you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Nick. That was great. So our final speaker of this session today is Professor Heather Brown. Heather's coming from the University of Lancaster, is that correct? And Heather's research interests are around the causes and consequences of health inequalities, and Heather's got a very long title which I will leave her to talk about.
Okay, so thank you. I just wanted to say, so my background it's applied health economics. And I come to this from, I guess, my PhD many years ago, looking at the economic causes and consequences of obesity. So it got me thinking about kind of where we live and how that impacts on our health and then our economic outcomes, and how that all then contributes to health inequalities. So from that, I guess for about the past 7 years, I've been trying to think about the food environment and how what we eat influences then our health, and as well contributes to kind of economic outcomes and how we do throughout the life course. And so what I'm doing today is based upon some of the work we've done at looking to think about how we can look at the food environment through a quantitative lens, so how we can kind of assess and monitor it nationally to kind of look at regional variations and how trends are changing over time, to help with planning and kind of reducing regional health inequalities. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of that work around how we measure and assess the food environment quantitatively, and then thinking about going forward a practical examples, exploring the growth of dark kitchens in the Northeast, which has been touched upon through some of the other presentations today. And apologies if I talk very quickly, I find all this thinking about food makes me really hungry, and it's close to lunchtime. So as Tim used the same definition of the food environment, which comes from him and Amelia from 2009, so it's just kind of how we access and use our environment. And so then thinking about, so how can we then measure the food environment? So what do we mean by a food business? And I guess as well as we can see over the last few years with the growth of online food delivery services, that kind of changes how we access food and how we eat food, and how people also engage with their local environment to obtain food. And as well as kind of been touched upon by some of the presentations today, we have people working kind of in different areas in both planning and local authorities, classifying businesses in different ways, partially just because of the frameworks that they work in and limits of how things are monitored, such as planners classifying food businesses slightly different to environmental health officers, and then how they can all work together to kind of come to a stated definition to help plan healthier places. So every single local authority in England has signed up to and I guess Scotland and Wales as well, has signed up to the Food Standards Agency Food Hygiene Rating Scheme. And through that then, all food businesses, or any kind of, not even a business, schools, community centres, any place where food is served that's not at room temperature, has to be inspected, or should be inspected, by an environmental health officer. And this is then, on the slide, the different ways that they classify these businesses. So you have restaurant, cafe, canteen, retail, educational settings, supermarkets, distributors, transporters, then hospital, childcare, caring, manufacturer, packing, mobile caterers, fast food and sandwich shops, import-export, hotel B&B, other catering, pubs, nightclubs, bars. And I guess the important things to note here are that fast food is classed with sandwich shops, so it's then difficult to kind of unpick, using this sort of data, what is considered fast food in planning and what's considered fast food by environmental health officers. And we're also going to come back to the other catering, but you'll see about that in a little while. So, and apologies, because before it used to be called A5, but they've recently changed that. So that is how kind of planners would classify hot food takeaways. So it's basically focused around food being sold for consumption off premises, but especially now with the change in definitions. So it's not always clearly defined what the business is. So you could have dual use, and that was touched upon in other presentations, and there could be uncertainty regarding which particular use class the business requires, especially with the growth of dark kitchens, which I'll come upon shortly. And however, to kind of create healthier environments, which has also been mentioned in other presentations, we have supplementary planning documents. You saw Lucy discussed in detail Gateshead planning documents, and the aim of these is to try and limit unhealthy food. And approximately 50% of LAs, as well as was shown in some of Michael's lovely maps, have these restrictions on new hot food takeaways. And I guess the important thing to note is that there are variations in them. So Gateshead, as Lucy mentioned, effectively restricts all new takeaways, but in other areas that's not necessarily the case. Quite a lot are just restricted around schools, so that means if it's not within 400 metres of a school, you can still open takeaways. And we've done, as I said, briefly mentioned, so we have the food hygiene rating scheme data. So this data set basically collects the outlet name, postcode, and type of food, or I guess classification, not type of food, of the business for all places in each local authority which sell food, and it then goes back to 2012, so you can have a longitudinal data set of all food outlets. There's some issues around during COVID because obviously environmental health officers weren't doing face-to-face inspections, and so they've kind of then dumped the data later on as they've done it, so you can't really get an idea of how the food environment has been changing because it's not necessarily impacting the time that the data was collected, but you can still see then by using this time you can get an idea of how things are changing over time still. So what we did is we first, in our SPHR funded project, which was over 2019-2020, we looked at if this data set could be used as a way to kind of monitor and assess the food environment. So we did a field audit in the northeast of England. Specifically, we looked at Gateshead and Northumberland, and we found that basically the outlets were in the data, were also in the field, so they matched. There was very few kind of differences, and then as well that it was valid in both urban and rural, and we looked at the geographical coordinates to see kind of if they were in the data and if they matched, because we had a GPS device, what we found, and we found that overall that they were within 75 meters of each other on average, so that we said that then therefore this could be a valuable resource to kind of assess the food environment in some of this different legislation around supplementary planning guidance, especially with the kind of 400 meters, so our data should be accurate enough to kind of capture some of that. So then what we did is firstly, we assessed the impact of specifically just a school exclusion zone, and that was in Newcastle, and that is the paper there. And we found that basically, because of the limits around what the SPD could do, it led to no significant change within the school exclusion zone and outside the school exclusion zone 3 years after the implementation of the SPD. But I guess it's still under review, so I couldn't put it here. We also evaluated the Gateshead SPD, and we found that the kind of blanket ban approach did lead to significant change in the density and proportion of takeaways. So kind of we called fast food sandwich shops, so it's kind of a more, I guess, inclusive definition of the actual planning thing, but we did find a significant change, and hopefully that will be accepted soon because it's been under review for ages. But so that kind of as well fits in with some of the stuff that Lucy was saying, so kind of thinking going forward that, you know, for other local authorities that don't have it, what it works and what doesn't work and what that means for kind of planning for health. So now I'm going to move on to the kind of next bit of what some of the stuff I've been thinking of going forward in this area. So I'm going to be talking about the rise of dark kitchens, which are also sometimes known as ghost or cloud kitchens, and a very basic definition of what I could find is that it's food prepared at separate takeaway premises rather than a street-facing premises, so the public cannot enter it. So the food is delivered to you and you never see where the food comes from. And usually they're windowless and consumers might not be aware that their food is coming from there. Okay, and then as I mentioned slightly earlier, so we have these SPDs, but it's not clear if these kind of premises would be classified as hot food takeaways so they can kind of get around some of the planning legislation around restricting food outlets. Especially because there's no public visiting the premises to collect the food themselves, so it kind of puts them in, I guess, an unusual position. But from what we've been doing, I guess this kind of definition of thinking more about some of the stuff Lucy said when they were making the case for the SPD and Gateshead, kind of what type of food is being sold at these premises. Is it all necessarily unhealthy? Kind of what does this mean going forward? Can we kind of say that this business is a dark kitchen, this isn't? So thinking about some needs for kind of work with environmental health teams who are inspecting some of these premises to say, you know, what are they finding? What are these businesses? What are they predominantly selling? When you go in there, do you think, oh, this is a dark kitchen, or do you think something else, to kind of get a better idea of how it looks in the field, as well as with planners and public health teams to think about, you know, what does a dark kitchen mean to them, about types of food sold, and thinking about how it could fit within existing planning laws, and how to understand what we mean by a dark kitchen, and how these different groups can work together to try to make sure that it's not negatively impacting on the health of the local area. So then this is some of the basic analysis that I was just playing around with of thinking about how we can think about dark kitchens. So this is what, if you go to the FSA food hygiene trainings and download the data, this is kind of what you get. So it's basically an Excel spreadsheet of every single food business in the local authority. So I just happened to go with Northumberland because this was some of this, we did the field work there. So just thinking about that we had some kind of existing knowledge of what is on the ground in Northumberland. And so then to think about kind of what might be dark kitchens, we looked through the different classifications, and we had a brief chat with the environmental health officer from Gateshead, Stuart Sorrell, who suggested that other caterers might be kind of where they would classify them, because it's not mobile caterers, it's not a restaurant, kitchen, fast food, sandwich shop. So thinking that that would be one place where we could start, so we did that. And within this group, you also have community halls, churches, social clubs, and other premises, which are definitely not dark kitchens. So what we did is we just went through the data, and if it said community hall, kind of we deleted the different ones that we were certain were not dark kitchens. And then we ended up with something like this. So this is, I just put the data in a statistical software package. So these are the different businesses that come up if you remove all the other bits, and I'm sure I've checked, but there probably is still some that shouldn't be in there because I removed it manually. And then what we did is we basically looked up everything that was on the data set in Google to see if we can kind of get an idea of what they were selling, and you know what that would mean in terms of the healthfulness of the food, and if it would be considered dark kitchen or not. And this is, as I say, also possibly a reflection of the fact that it's Northumberland and it's a very rural area, that a lot of them were people selling cakes or kind of Sunday lunches from like an outbuilding on their property. So they had like, you know, so you couldn't go and pick it up, but they deliver it to you. There was also lots of people selling sausage rolls, kind of random things. So these are just two examples, and a lot of them just had Facebook pages where they kind of said, and they would put in special deals that they had, like Mother's Day tea and things like that, where you could order from. There was only one that we found that was selling, I guess, more what you'd think of as a dark kitchen, like it was selling Indian food that they delivered to your house, but they had on the website saying, you know, about the homemade nature of it, so it could still have been in someone's outbuilding that they were selling it. So then thinking about what we can do going forward is, I think there needs to be a bit of a discussion amongst the different people working in this space of what is meant by a dark kitchen, as well as thinking about geographical variations on what people are doing, incorporating things like Facebook Marketplace and the kind of rise of people selling food from their homes. Would that be within this definition, or how does that all fit together? And then once we have kind of this working definition and possibly some concrete examples of businesses, to create a data set that can possibly use for where you could use machine learning on the FSA data to try and classify different businesses from this into different categories of dark kitchens, or kind of healthy versus unhealthy, other catering, things like that. And then the other aspect is talking with these businesses to understand kind of the geographical areas they covered. So that's, I guess, a different thing with, the bricks and mortar, is you can say, well, you walk to it or you drive your car, but how far do these businesses serve, and what does that mean then for health? And how this might vary by geography. So you could think of kind of mostly rural kind of areas such as Northumberland or Cumbria, where you might have they might cover huge areas, or how that differs to some place like London, where these businesses might have much more smaller area that they cover, and who goes to it and what that means, and kind of who's buying this food as well might very much differ in these areas. And then that's it.
Thank you.
I was just speaking with Paul from Tees Valley Sport, and we were saying during lockdown, some of the outlets you were saying that I was probably a regular buyer. I tried pretzels, brownies, all various things from these businesses popping up. I don't know when dark kitchens started to emerge, but do you think it's coming from lockdown? Do you think it's coming from people who are trying to come outside of planning, trying to counteract planning policy and law, or a combination of both?
Well, I think that's a difficult thing with some of these businesses, the ones selling brownies or pretzels. They're kind of, I would think of more self-employed people who are looking, I don't know, or even people who possibly during lockdown were looking for a career change. They were like, well, I'm just going to do something different. And thinking about, what that means compared to others, large businesses that are opening kind of, these, where they're making like takeaways, for Just Eats. That is a completely different thing. And that's why I think there needs to be more understanding about what we mean, who's using it, where are these businesses located, and kind of thinking that they might not be dark kitchens. We might need another definition for those, but how that impacts, I guess, on the food landscape, and how we can make sure that there's some way to monitor and assess, because otherwise, I guess it would be almost impossible then to kind of plan for health if you don't have some idea of what's going on.
Yeah, definitely. Probably. I think during lockdown you were just so keen on supporting local businesses and community setting up that I was buying things and actually not even really thinking about, well, these have just set up, and what's actually behind them, what support mechanisms are in place to make sure that they're, I guess, healthy for one, but also around hygiene.
Yeah, so I guess that's a big thing with like more the unregulated ones are just Facebook Marketplace, the hygiene issues.
Any other questions? Oh, Matt.
Hi. Just in terms of kind of accountability in the infrastructure, you've got Uber Eats and Just Eat and various different companies now that are actually delivering the food. What are their responsibilities around ensuring that the providers meet food agency standards, are reputable? And if there are no accountabilities, how do you kind of hold organisations who aren't making significant profits under maybe a legislative framework?
Okay. I'm probably not the best person to answer this, but, I think I don't know. So I'd assume they'd have some checks, but I don't know what they are and how that works and kind of how they assess, that they're doing everything they should in terms of kind of business classification, food hygiene, all of those sort of things. So that is, not my area, unfortunately.
Anything else? Okay, thank you very much, Heather. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for your patience with our technology. It's been a fantastic morning, and I've got lots and lots of ideas that we're going to go away and discuss and think about how we take forward, both with our policy partners as well as with planners. So thank you to all our speakers, from our speakers in London and in Gateshead, as well as people in the room. Much appreciated. A huge thanks as well to those of you who have come here today. It's been really, really nice to have people in the room, and also to the people behind the scenes and who are up there behind the door, the Fuse team who made this happen. So they worked very hard. We also have some more Fuse events coming up, and I'll put those on. So there's an event which is also going to be hybrid, and that is around exploring and understanding access to community-based mental health and substance use services for people experiencing homelessness. So the in real life version of this is in Newcastle, but it will be available online. And of course our fantastic Fuse conference, which is again happening in Newcastle in person only in June. So there is still time to register for that, and that's about translational research. So really how these areas that we talk about, from planning through to homelessness, how we translate that into action and to change. And once again, can I just encourage people who are in the room and online who'd like to help us with creating our how-to plan to take our School of Public Health research forward, please get in touch with either myself or Helen. But thank you very much and enjoy lunch.